There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Well, fix it, dear Henry, well, fix it, dear Henry, fix it!
With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, with what shall I fix it, dear Liza, with what?
With straw, dear Henry, with straw, dear Henry, with straw.
But the straw is too long, dear Liza, but the straw is too long, dear Liza, too long.
So cut it, dear Henry, so cut it, dear Henry, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what?
Use the hatchet, dear Henry, use the hatchet, dear Henry, the hatchet!
But the hatchet's too dull, dear Liza, but the hatchet's too dull, dear Liza, too dull.
So sharpen it, dear Henry, so sharpen it, dear Henry, sharpen it!
With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what?
Use the stone, dear Henry, use the stone, dear Henry, the stone.
But the stone is too dry, dear Liza, but the stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry.
So wet it, dear Henry, so wet it, dear Henry, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, with what shall I wet it, dear Liza, with what?
With water, dear Henry, with water, dear Henry, water.
With what shall I carry it, dear Liza, with what shall I carry it, dear Liza, with what?
Use the bucket, dear Henry, use the bucket, dear Henry, bucket!
But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Kill him.